Good evening, and welcome to another biography event. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. As some of you may know, last year she gave $10 million to our endowment fund, plus another $5 million in matching grants. So if any of you care to drop $1 million on us, the Leon Levy Foundation will match it with another $1 million, and we'd name one of our 4 fellowships after you. And believe it or not, this has just happened. Someone just stepped forward and gave us $1 million. They're so enamored with the cause of biography. So seriously, this is a great opportunity. So that's my pitch for the day. Please note that our next event will be on Tuesday, November 4th, when we will celebrate Peter Trachtenberg's The Twilight of Bohemia, Westbeth and the Last Artists in New York. Trachtenberg will be in conversation with the writer Francine Prose, the artist Howard Michaels, and the curator and writer Sir Rodney. This event will take place in the Elabash Concert Hall. Please mark your calendars and register for this and our other events on the Leon Levy website. If you have not done so already, please register your email address on our handsome new website so that you can be notified of future events. But tonight I'm delighted to be here this evening to introduce Professor Stephen J. Zipperstein, who will be discussing his new biography of Philip Roth. He will be in conversation with Judith Thurman. Stephen Zipperstein is the Daniel Koshlin Professor in Jewish Culture and History at Stanford University. He's the author of 10 books, including Pogrom, Kishinev, and The Tilt of History, and Rosenfeld's Lives, Fame, Oblivion, and the Furies of Writing, among many others. Zipperstein has taught at Oxford and at universities in Russia, Poland, and France. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Judith Thurman is the author of Isaac Dinesen, The Life of a Storyteller, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, Secrets of the Flesh, A Life of Colette, which won the Los Angeles Times and the Salon Book Awards for Biography, and 2 essay collections, Cleopatra's Nose, 39 Varieties of Desire, and A Left-Handed Woman, which won the Penn Diamonstein
Spielvogel, nobody can.
Thank you, I can't pronounce it. Award for the Art of the Essay. She began contributing to the New Yorker in 1987, where she has been a staff writer since the year 2000. Stephen and Judith will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our in-person audience. This session is being live streamed, so hello out there to our virtual audience. At the end of the evening, Stephen will be signing books out in the lobby outside. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. I now turn over the conversation to Judith Thurman. Thank you.
Thank you. This is on. Good. I am thrilled to be here with Stephen for all kinds of reasons. I knew Philip Roth really, really well for 45 years. And so he was like a family member. As a biographer myself, I know that it's very hard for the family, especially the children, the spouse, the whatever, when they read a biography, to recognize the person that they knew. And Philip is so present in Steve's life, and with its wonderful title, Stung by Life, that I felt after so many starts and stops and bumps on the road to this book, that he got the biography he deserves. So I think I'd like you to hear, it's important to hear the voice of the biography. That meant the world to Philip. He was in the beginning was the Word, and in the end for him was the Word. And so the language of the biography would have been very important to him had he lived to read it, and it is to us.
All right, this is my voice. I'm going to just quote a paragraph.
Hold it closer.
Paragraph or two from the introduction. Okay. Often he declared he trusted the actual palpable events of life far more than the fiction he read so assiduously, and that he so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of his writing. Arguably, he drew on books for the writing of his novels more so than any other widely read English language novelist of his time, while remaining distrustful of books as a source for inspiration. The reliance on books is apparent throughout. Goodbye Columbus provides a gloss on David Reisman's then influential The Lonely Crowd. His first novel, Letting Go, is meant as an extended conversation with Henry James. Flaubert's shadow rests heavily on the next novel, When She Was Good. Fierce, unresolved combat between Freud and Nietzsche is foregrounded in Portnoy's Complaint. And then there's evidence of Lionel Trilling, Conrad, Edna O'Brien, Mann, Celine, Shakespeare, Melville, Kierkegaard, Camus, Schlesinger, Joyce, always Kafka. Yet, Roth took to heart the chasm between the written and unwritten world, a term popularized by the social thinker guru Paul Goodman, distrusting the capacity of books to turn life into abstractions or ideology. These demons would have to be extracted if credible fiction was to happen. So earnest, so unflinching was his commitment to the life of writing. A quote of all the contemporary novelists, wrote the critic James Wood on hearing of Roth's decision at the age of 80 to retire from writing. Quote, he is the one who made writing seem a necessary and continuous act, inextricable from the continuities and struggle of being alive, and so astonishingly funny. A good example, this cited by Wood as his own favorite, is how Zuckerman decides in The Ghostwriter that the lovely young woman he spots at the home of Emmanuel Lonoff is the real Anne Frank, whom he would manage to woo and marry, thus persuading his father that he isn't the self-hating Jew his detractors have accused him of being. I'm pretty sure that this is one of the reasons why he wrote The Ghostwriter, because of this line, is she Jewish? I keep seeing myself coming back to New Jersey. It's a book built around his search, his desire to be an independent writer, while at the same time not losing his links to family, losing his links to Newark, losing his links to his origins. And so he spots this woman, all hair and face, almost bodiless, in the home of an admired writer. And he begins to fantasize that she's Anne Frank. And basically the book is actually built in some way. This very earnest study of a writer is really built around a joke. And the joke is this one. I met a marvelous young woman, he imagines telling his father, while I was up in New England. I love her and she loves me. We're going to be married. Married, but so fast, his father says. Nathan, is she Jewish? Is she Jewish? But who is she? She's Anne Frank. Imagine building an entire serious rumination about the nature of writing around a Jimmy Durante-like joke. And Jimmy Durante's in the novel, too.
This is a great segue to my first question. I didn't know how to structure the questions because there's so much I wanted to ask you about and I want to hear about. But you're the I don't know what your title is at the Jewish Live series at Yale. What is it exactly? You're the head.
Series editor.
Right. He's the series editor of the Jewish Live series, which is published, I don't know how many, but wonderful.
Approximately 76.
76 biographies of exceptional people who happen to be Jewish one way or the other. Some of them.
We begin with Sarah Bernhard. We're awaiting the coming of Jesus. So it's a reasonably unorthodox medley.
Yes, and these are short books, and so you were going to tell us the genesis, and it really is a biblical genesis, this book. In the beginning was the Word, and in the beginning were the Jews, and in the beginning was a naked couple. So how did it evolve from a 200-page Jewish life series to?
You know, I always knew that, well, Roth had been in my head ever since my teenage years. I described this at the very, very end of the book. I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home, and I wrestled with Orthodoxy, and desperately wanted to stay an Orthodox Jew, but found the insistence, especially in deductive thinking, to be crippling intellectually. And just on the verge of going to yeshiva in Chicago, I read Whacking Off and Partisan Review. Now, I read it as a teenager. It was helpful for all kinds of reasons, obvious and not. But the most important legacy, the most important lesson it taught me was that the world that I was hoping to enter into was no panacea. Alexander Portnoy was a neurotic who had all the freedom of the world, and he was profoundly unhappy. It taught me that there wasn't utopia out there. And that helped me actually negotiate my way as a non-Orthodox Jew, as an historian, and then eventually as his biographer. And so I finished a very different book, Pogrom Kishinev and the Tilt of History, and there's this long period of time between a book actually is finished or essentially finished, or you think it's finished, and when it actually emerges in the flesh. And so it was in that period that I decided, I'd already started Jewish Lives, that I would take the plunge and then try to write his life. Blake Bailey was already contracted to write the authorized biography. Philip, from the outset, was receptive. You know, he had signed an exclusive agreement with Blake, but he was unsurprisingly a rule breaker. And he was willing to share with me all of the primary material he shared with Blake, but Blake understandably refused. And I started the book anyway. And then Blake's book was eviscerated, and I was left with all the material. And by then, I mean, tragically, as I saw it, Philip died. But from the vantage point of my role as a biographer, he wasn't there to look over my shoulders in the way that he looked over Blake's. And so I was able to not take him simply at his word. And of course, he was a fiction writer. He's not, you don't take a fiction writer at his word. And so I had a certain freedom that Blake didn't. I also, then a lot of people spoke to me many of whom didn't speak with Blake. And I can't exactly explain why, except I suspect that my having led an immeasurably less punctuated and eventual life previous to my writing of Roth helped in my getting people to trust me. I can't, but why did you trust me?
You're trustworthy.
What?
You're trustworthy. You are grown up.
You're saying this in front of my wife, so thank you.
Yes. No, but Blake Bailey, whom I knew very, very well in the course of his work on the biography, was, I won't say anything libelous or slanderous, but he was a difficult, spiky, pugnacious person who, it's not that he didn't listen, but he sort of was drawing you out in a way that had no real empathy.
You know, I understood from the outset that people's lives belong to themselves. They don't belong to a biographer. Biography is an intrinsically intrusive genre. And so you want to learn about someone's life, but they don't owe you anything. They don't owe you details. And so that's how I approached the research for this. And I spoke to probably about 120 people, and then used many archives, and then wrote and rewrote and rewrote again.
I think also that many people who were close to Philip had been so badly burned by Blake's book, and they loved him and wanted to see justice done. and you arrived with your brilliant credentials and your seriousness and your endowed chair and your publishing history and listened. And there was another, all of us had been through a bunch of biographers.
I think, curiously, for Philip, I arrived, if you will, as a nice Jewish boy.
You did.
And for a nice Jewish boy to have written his biography, there's this certain intrinsic irony in that, no?
There is, but that's why he said that he was suspicious of Blake, because Blake is a wasp from, I don't know where, places that there's lots of wasps. And he had said, well, why do you think you can write the life of a Jewish writer? And he said, well, I'm not gay, and I wrote the life and I'm not, and he said, I'm not a drunk, which wasn't true, but I wrote the life of, so Philip bought that. But I want to go back to the Jewish life, because it's a structural, it's the good Jewish boy, the bad Jewish boy, the good son, the rebel, the heretic to his own community. It's ground zero, do you not think? Or do you, maybe you don't?
Yeah, you know, the insistence on Philip's part, on Saul Bellow's part, on Bernard Malamud's part,
Yeah.
that they weren't Jewish writers, it's a tick. A definition of an American Jewish writer is someone who insists that they're not an American Jewish writer. That's a workable definition. The notion of Jewish, certainly when Philip came of age, was that it's somehow conceptually small. It reduces you in size. You know, no one questions whether Chekhov's South Russian inflections reduce him in size, or Eudora Welty's Southern background, or Faulkner's, but somehow Jewish. It's the notion of sort of Jews being a tribe, a kind of inaccessible tribe, and with curious, arcane practices. And so, I mean, Philip insists up until the time, essentially, that Goodbye Columbus is typeset, that he's not a Jewish writer. Every single one of the stories in the collection is about Jews. And he writes one novel without Jews in an act of anger, and then writes, 29 others. So
And writes about Israel, and writes about in some ways the prodigal son. But the contradictions. This is a huge subject for you and for the life of Philip Roth. You learn as a biographer that you have to find a structure to contain your subject's contradictions, but you can't resolve them. But with Philip, this is particularly acute because the contradictions are so Manichaean. And I was just going through the book and writing a few things down. There's rectitude and freedom, clinging and repudiation, allegiance and rebellion, the unknown and the familiar, the good boy and the bad boy. And then you quote Albert Goldman as saying, the moral incongruities of contemporary civilization, which he was always, a poet of those incongruities. The hunger, this is all from Syria, the hunger for validation and the glee in giving profound offense. The sense of the freedom being everything, but very touchy about criticism at the same time that he baits the critics. So can you discuss how?
Yeah, he's enormously touchy, and he constantly is stretching his neck out with almost the certainty that he's going to be criticized. All those books he writes after Portnoy's complaint, he achieves a stature comparable to that of Taylor Swift. No writer had actually achieved anything comparable before, and he claims that he's unhappy with it, and then he wants to return to it. He writes Sabbath Theater, as in part assuming that Sabbath Theater is going to have the same sensational impact that Portnoy's complaint, but no book in the English language. He published it at a time when a writer could actually become a megastar. And I think the people who run the Biography Center could acknowledge that's something of the past. And so I didn't feel I needed to resolve these contradictions. I didn't feel I needed to be his priest or his rabbi. it was my responsibility to actually show it and let the reader make whatever judgments the reader might make. And why it is that someone so thin-skinned would write a book like his Nixon book, which is basically the kind of book, and I don't know if you'd agree with me, the kind of thing that you might write in a fraternity, late at night. And the baseball book, The Breast, which I think was savagely reviewed. I think it actually has more wisdom than some people have noticed. But he takes these incredible risks, and he's bruised by the reaction, but then he continues to do it. And I didn't need to figure out why. I needed to actually explain that he did it. And why the he's an immensely sexually alluring man, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and I mean, he's so alluring. His co-counselor in the camp where he met Brenta Potemkin, Maxine Grofsky, contacted me, and I was able to interview him. And I learned that he so hated the wife of the man who was director of the camp, that on the first parents' visiting day, he announced to the campers that she had lost her chastity belt. And in front of all the parents, they had this exercise where they were trying to find her chastity belt. It wasn't lost, of course. And yet, when his co-counselor returned as the camp doctor several years later, the first thing she asked him was where she could find Philip. She was drawn to him. So there was something deeply sexual about him. He would propose to people. I mean, I've met maybe 8, 9 women. He didn't really mean to marry. Did he propose to you?
No.
Okay, okay, fine. He didn't propose to everyone he loved, but he proposed to a lot of people without really meaning it. He'd fall in love in a matter of minutes.
No, it was a joke.
But not really.
It was a joke. It was just, I love you, marry me, after, a 5-minute conversation at a...
I know. So, so I didn't need, it seemed to me, to figure all of it out. There were immense internal contradictions. But at the epicenter, in other words, when you write a biography, you want to identify what was crucial to the person that you're writing about. What was crucial to him always was writing, not the sex, and that's where I think Blake Bailey's book stumbled. What was central to him, his true loves, were his books.
Absolutely, and he was an unchaste art monk, and the books came first, and he turned down several of the long-term partners whom he loved very much, and loved their life together, wanted to have a child, and he couldn't. He couldn't.
Well, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I know several of the women who were in his life said to me that it was once women began to express their own personal needs that he began to distance himself. But usually it was after 2 or 3 years, and after the sexual excitement was no longer nearly as exciting, and yet so many of the women who were in his life, remained in his life, were there at his deathbed, and including women who he had treated rather shabbily. I think what I came to understand, and tell me if you agree or disagree, is that pretty much he treated the men in his life quite similar to the way he treated the women in his life. And he decided sometime in his mid-20s, that he was going to be as great a writer as Melville. And I don't think he felt there was all that much discretionary time for much emotional involvement. This is what he was going to do. And so the men in his life he dispensed with. So the relationships with men were clearly different from the relationships with women in one significant way. But otherwise there was a marked similarity, as I saw it.
But maybe when you think of great writers, Proust locked up in his cork-lined room, going out at midnight to the Ritz, but just to hear conversation that he would then bring back and put into the book, and Virginia Woolf, who was cared for so protectively by Leonard, who kept away bores and distractions, and it's not every writer. It's many writers live in the world just fine, but many have this I think, I don't want to use the sentiment, I'm not using it in a sentimental way. There's a sense of the sacred flame that they can't expose to the winds of chit-chat.
Well, I think it was you who told me about Philip's use of the term divine curse, just as his capacity was beginning to wane, his writing capacity alongside his sexual capacity. And both, I think, he saw as divine curses. He was, despite his reputation, in many ways most brilliantly a writer of childhood, or especially that moment at the end of childhood, just before adolescence, as he put it, when at one point, I think in Sabbath's Theater, where the only woman that he lusted after was his mama. And he looked back at that. He was able to recreate those moments really vividly. And to some extent, sexuality, sexual urges, enormously powerful, were in a kind of divine burden. And for him.
Well, he's often writing on the cusp of manhood at whatever age he's writing. And so he captures the puerility, not that his writing is at all puerile, but he captures the craziness of adolescence, the craziness of the adolescent boy, the pulling and the pushing and the separation drama, the drama of separation. And that's so much, I've always felt that was so much a part of the work.
Well, I mean, I think the moment that he captures most vividly is before those arguments begin, before the arguments with Herman, his father, begins, before the urge, the incredible sexual urge actually surfaces. It's there that's one of the areas where he soars. And you see that repeatedly in his most sexual book, Sabbath's Theater. And so there were so many internal contradictions. And so a part of the task was to figure out how you write about someone who wrote 31 books about himself but didn't. And so what do you say that he didn't say? And how do you employ your own voice in writing about someone whose voice was so extraordinary and distinctive? Will your voice become simply submerged in a study of him? And when I showed my wife an early draft, she said, "Stop quoting him," and because he was submerging me, and so it was a kind of. But at the same time, I wanted readers who weren't reading him any longer. I wanted to write sentences where people who knew his work intimately and people who didn't know his work at all could read the same sentence and actually get something from it. And so I tried to basically interrogate every sentence in the book to try to see if it well delivered. And because it seemed, given the opportunity to write about someone like Roth, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, and I just wanted to do it as well as possible.
Going back to the Jews, it just occurred to me that the sort of traumatic experience of, as he thought, being attacked. You'll tell the story in a minute. The Jews of his, well, I grew up my family is Jewish, and they emigrated in the 19th century. Nobody was involved in Europe in the Holocaust. We were so secular that we had a Christmas tree, and nobody,
But you didn't have a Christmas tree because you're not supposed to have a Christmas tree. You had a Christmas tree because you had a Christmas tree.
We like Christmas trees. Anyway, so I never had the pressure of, until I went to Brandeis, in which there was this sense of being repossessed by, but wait a minute, there was a sense of ownership that I felt, that he felt for his whole life. And for him, for me, it wasn't an important thing at all, but for him, it was crucial. And to be the individuation that his work is all about, and the Jewish, the assumption of the tribal Jews of Newark, that you're one of them, and you owe a omerta, a sort of debt of honor to not disgrace them, to not give anybody any reasons to hate Jews, to not expose anything, not expose any secrets. And that was one of the, seems to me, you get that very much so.
Yeah, I think so. I ran this by Philip. He wouldn't agree or disagree, but I think I'm right about this. So he's deeply influenced by Isaac Babel, the Soviet Jewish writer, one of whose stories is The Awakening. Some of you may have read it. And it's a story about a boy in Odessa, a place that's produced a lot of great Jewish violinists in the late 19th, early 20th century. His father decides he's going to be a great violinist. He finds a violin teacher for him. He has no talent. He hangs out at the sea. And 5 weeks pass. He looks out the window, and Mr. Zagorsky, the violin teacher, is heading into their apartment building. So he hides in the only place that one could actually have any privacy in a Jewish home, the toilet. And the father tries to break down the door, the lock stays, and he stays there until nighttime. His aunt comes to pick him up and bring him over to her house. They're walking through the streets of Odessa, and then there's a moment. The narrator says, "I was thinking of running away," but he never does. And it's that moment that Philip circles around time and time again in his work. The sense of perhaps trying to escape it, to deny it, to just get away from it. And then he explores how his characters never can escape Jewishness. The books are profoundly Jewish in that they're actually exploring the prospect of an escape that'll never happen. Now, what Judith was alluding to was I became persuaded that there was a book to write early on when I discovered that this event that Philip returned to time and again, a symposium with Ralph Ellison and an Italian-American writer at Yeshiva University in 1962. Philip's invited there. He claims that he's asked whether he'd write the same kind of stories during the Holocaust or in the 30s. He describes how he's excoriated by the audience. So I discovered the tape in the bowels of Yeshiva University. The audience loved him. The audience laughed at his jokes. But what he remembered, all he remembered, and he described this as comparable to Spinoza's excommunication. He was so persuasive in describing this that Salman Rushdie actually said, "Your experience was worse than mine," you know. Yeah. So the audience loved him, but apparently what happened, and I was able to talk to some people who were at the event. At the end of the event, the people who didn't like him, and this is from my experience as Jewish practice as Passover Seder, the people who didn't like him rushed and told him how they hated him, and to the stage. Don't do this. And that's what he remembered. So what it persuaded me of was that there was a book to write about the interplay between what this novelist remembered about his life and what occurred, and also the function of rage.
Yeah, let's go there.
He's immensely rageful, but at the same time, and he does this with almost every aspect of himself, he interrogates rage. He understands the underbelly of rage. So many of the characters who actually experience the worst fates are people who are inundated by rage, like the sister of the Plot Against America. And so he's constantly interrogating his own inclinations. Just one other example of that, his most controversial early work, Defender of the Faith, which appears, the first piece of his that appears in the New Yorker, is built around a soldier who's shirking responsibility and who claims that he has to attend Passover Seder and he can't do various duties. I learned from someone who was in the army with Philip that Philip was like this, that Philip actually insisted that he couldn't do duty on Friday nights because he had to go to services. Now, how often Philip Roth went to Friday night services is
I think he snuck out to see a girl in the town where he was.
What?
I think he snuck out to see a girlfriend.
Yeah, okay, fine. Well, that makes sense. But the Friday night services
No,
don't.
no.
Yeah, so that he's constantly interjecting his own questionable characteristics into his stories and interrogating them in ways that he didn't do in everyday life, but he did in his fiction. He took his fiction in many ways more seriously. And yeah.
He struggled for the detachment in the fiction that was his way of not resolving, but of containing those contradictions. And in life, he didn't. He didn't get in some relationships and in some respects, he did have a great sense of humor about his craziness. I remember once in the country, he was going through a terrible period of withdrawal from Ambien and his sleeplessness and his back problems. And his friends took turns staying over with him to make sure he wouldn't kill himself. And we were going for a walk, and he was just in pain and rage at his body and rage at everything. And he took off his hat and he threw it down and he jumped up and down on it. And then he took the hat and he threw it into the bushes. And then he turned and he looked at me and we both started laughing hysterically. So
why, let's turn to you for a moment. Because he actually, he asked you
yeah,
to be his biographer.
in 2000, yeah.
And you were involved with him in ways that I was not.
Well, no, I had a brief romance with him, very brief. It was
Mine was even briefer.
right. Yours was brief, very brief, and then we really became friends, and we were friends for about 45 years. So yeah.
So why didn't you do what I did? Why aren't
Well,
I?
Philip,
why aren't I sitting in that seat and asking you about your
I would
biography?
only write about a dead subject. Let's just, for starters, that's a very big starter. And the idea of this person I was so close to, breathing down my neck for the 18 years that he still had to live. Of course, one didn't know how long he still had to live, and I knew how controlling he was. And we had a wonderful friendship, but I also didn't think the friendship would survive. And I didn't think I would survive. So I said no.
Those are important considerations.
Yeah. Also, I just finished writing Colette, which took 8 years. I needed a break. I didn't want to go back under. I needed to fill my lungs with.
Yeah, it'd be hard to move from Colette to Philip Roth.
Not so hard. It was Philip who got me to write Colette.
No, I understand. I mean, I understand why Philip was interested in Colette. I
Yeah.
understand why you, finishing Colette, didn't write Philip.
There's something that I was teaching, guest lecturing at Barnard, and one of the writers I was teaching was Elena Ferrante, and she was like Philip, influenced by the same writers as a young woman, and she didn't think much of women writers. And she said she was almost in, except for a few, Elsa Morante and Virginia Woolf, but she said she was always disappointed because she expected to see the unsayable on the page, and that women writers didn't get around to saying the unsayable. And the unsayable was very important to Philip. And what Ferrante, and what I think, I thought about that when I was writing about Ferrante, because the unsayable is either what you may not say because of who you are in your class or your gender or whatever, or what you cannot say because you've internalized the taboo. And I think he was always striving for the unsayable.
Yeah, I think most nakedly, if you will, in the dying animal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's an extraordinary book. It's Keith Gesson, in an amazing review essay in The Nation, I quoted in my book, compares it to Tolstoy's anti-marriage tirades, and but he uses his character Kepesh, who's his most selfish character. He usually uses Zuckerman, who's racked by ambivalence, closer to who Philip was. Kepesh is an absolute narcissist, and it's about the way in which he teaches a class, a place like the New School, and then once a year, and then at the end of the quarter, end of the semester, once he's graded students, he sleeps with one of the female students. And it's about his relationship of sorts with a woman who has the most beautiful breasts. It's this tale of the objectification of a woman, but it's above all a tale of agony, because Philip, who's writing this in old age, is imagining Kepesh at 71 sleeping with young women who will almost invariably leave him. And it's a study of the underbelly of sex, the underbelly of obsession, the underbelly of so many of the qualities that Philip himself had. And it's a very good example of his, I think, his capacity to interrogate some of his most intimate inclinations. And he, so I never really tired reading him. And it seems to me that he hasn't aged as a writer in the way that so many of his contemporaries, Updike, Cheever, have. Extraordinary stylists.
Bellow too, I would say.
And Bellow too, yeah. He, unlike Bellow, though he's very much a writer of ideas, as I described initially earlier on, you don't know what books he's interrogating, he doesn't actually. He doesn't hit you over the head with Rudolf Steiner in the way that Bellow does, and yet they're all there. All this reading is there. Just one other quality of his that really impressed me, even in the writing of a perhaps unsuccessful novel like The Breast. He, in the middle of the narration, and it's Kepesh who turns into a breast, and Philip insisted that he wrote the book because after Portnoy, it just seemed as if he was a sexual bandit, and so he imagined himself running around town as a breast. Kepesh actually becomes alarmed by the following. He says, maybe I'm not really a breast, but I've been ruined by too much reading. I've been reading too much Dostoevsky. I've been reading too much Gogol. He even interrogates his insistence on reading. Interrogates really everything, and then in the last years of his life.
Is there anything more Jewish than that?
Than reading too much Gogol?
No,
Yeah,
than interrogating everything.
Yeah, I don't know that it's an intrinsically Jewish quality. It's hard to know what are intrinsically Jewish qualities. Does one see intrinsically Jewish qualities in the Mandami response to Mandami? I don't know. There are many different sorts of Jews, and but these were his qualities.
The ones I know are very argumentative. They're so argumentative that one of them once said to the other one, "Eddie, you're as argumentative as I am." And Eddie said, "No, I'm not." That to me was sort of... I wanted to talk about Philip. Well, I wanted to talk about women more, because one of the reasons he was terrified of the charges of misogyny and the reaction to the debacle with Blake Bailey and being very credibly accused of rape and of grooming and all of the rest of it, resounded.
Blake credibly accused of. Yeah.
Blake credibly accused. Sort of like a tsunami washed over Philip. And some of the reactions to the Blake debacle were to charge Philip with sort of as almost like an accomplice, which was, of course, not even, it was untrue, it was ridiculous. But did that, how much did that, of course, by then Philip was dead. He didn't know any of this.
Yeah, I mean, to conflate his behavior with Blake's is absurd, but he is, above all, a chronicler of the urges of men.
Yes.
And there's still a lot of men. And many of the women in his novels are flat.
Yes, they are.
And are there to service the needs of men. And so one doesn't read him in order to understand the inner workings of female life, but one does read him to understand without any without the kind of defensiveness that he would employ in everyday life. The most unseemly aspects of the life of men. And he's willing to confront these things up and through old age. He confronts the diminishment of old age. And earlier on, he insists when he's writing Sabbath's Theater, which is built around Mickey Sabbath, who's overweight and who acts on every single nasty urge of his. He acknowledges that this is a character most closely modeled on himself. It's the Philip without any ambivalence. It's the Philip who's not torn by being a good Jewish boy. It's the Philip who actually is acknowledging his ugliest urges. It's the Philip who actually acknowledges that underneath the surface of one's otherwise placid life, there's ugliness, there's death, there's horrible illness, there's diminishment. Just like in American Pastoral, where he describes the making of those beautiful gloves, where the making of those gloves is a rancid process. And he acknowledges his father's bowel explosion, something that one doesn't write about, something that we do hidden behind doors. And yet in Philip, he acknowledges those aspects of life that are otherwise we see as ugly, but they're intrinsic to living. And so I think that's among the reasons why he remains pertinent.
And why also he wasn't Mickey Sabbath. So that it's also important to remember that he was not Mickey Sabbath.
But he was not Lonoff, but as Claire Bloom probably correctly says, and I described this in my chapter on the ghostwriter, he's modeling the Lonoff character on himself. He's imagining what it's like. He's written several books before the ghostwriter that are panned and are basically ignored and aren't bought. He imagines, and he's living in the Berkshires or near the Berkshires in Connecticut, and he imagines what it might be like if he just continues to turn these sentences around year after year, live with Claire Bloom, who's going to almost invariably be dissatisfied, and turn flabby, and then he writes this character, and how many of us are willing to imagine these things about ourselves?
Raise your hands. I want to leave time for questions. Sorry, and so the brave person has to go. Some brave person has to go first, and then I'm sure others will follow. Yes, sir. Wait, that's going to give you a mic.
This is necessary for the Zoom audience. I'm thinking of others here.
Could you speak to Philip Roth as sort of a political prophet? Because I was recently, I've recently read the Great American Novel that has some brilliant passages describing sort of what's happening now politically. And then also, my wife and I were listening to The Plot Against America on a long car trip, and it also seemed so prescient. This is America today. So I'm just throwing that out as Roth as a prophet or a seer of this country.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I was going to.
Yeah, it's complicated because he doesn't see himself as a political novelist. In fact, he actually sees politics as the antithesis of literature, and insists on that in I Married a Communist, and yet of course he is, and he writes The Plot Against America. His last novel is about a plague, and finished not long before his death in 2018. We all know what actually happens in 2018. He has strong political views. He's very much a product of a kind of era where Roosevelt is president. He's maybe even more impressed with Eleanor Roosevelt than with FDR. And he's a liberal politically. So I think he does certainly have certain political passions. And he hates the current guy who's in Washington, and already in his first term. And I mean, anyone who actually takes language seriously has to deplore him. And strongly seems to be a term that he really likes. And I think Philip described how he knows 51 words. And but he feels strongly about anti-Semitism. He imagines when he's a young man that he'll actually work as a lawyer for the ADL. And it's clear in so many of his essays that he's very good at arguing his own case. But he doesn't see himself as a political writer, though, of course, you're right. He stumbles upon topics that end up being so politically relevant. And I would describe that as more stumbling than intentional. And, you know, he writes about diasporism, which now is a current notion among some, especially younger Jews, as a joke. The notion that diaspora was a panacea for Jews is something that he just sees as utterly absurd. He writes with enormous intelligence about Israel. I mean, arguably The Counterlife and Operation Shylock are the best books written in the English language about Israel. And yet he doesn't take much interest in Israel before he does. And so I don't know that he doesn't actually turn to Israel for political reasons. He turns to Israel in order to imagine what it's like to change one's life. He's imagining changing his life in the mid-'80s, and that's why he puts his brother in Israel as a West Bank settler. So he chances upon politics. I don't know that he actually gravitates toward politics, is how I would see it.
Questions?
Someone else?
Yes?
Yes, hello. Since you've described him as somebody who was not particularly interested in politics, and somebody who was very self-involved in his personal literary world, could you say something about his work with Eastern European writers? Because there he clearly did want to be involved with other people and for political reasons.
Yeah, I think at the outset, it's not for political reasons. As I argue in my book, he's interested in Kafka. He's interested in Kafka for a long time, to be sure. But he actually becomes, according to Klima and others, the greatest expert in the English-speaking world about Kafka only after he's attacked by Irving Howe. I see this, he's an immensely talented, immensely touchy artist. And Irving Howe, in December 1972, in the pages of commentary, takes back, Irving Howe was sort of the reigning cultural critic of his age, and who reviewed Goodbye Columbus favorably. In December 1972, he takes back everything nice that he said about Philip. He said, what I said about Goodbye Columbus, I'm taking back, it's lousy, and everything he's produced subsequently is even worse. But the charge that hits Philip the most, as I see it, is when Irving Howe claims that Philip's is a thinness of culture, and Philip's defensive about his knowledge, his erudition. He never learns a foreign language. He's in school. He's at a good school, University of Chicago, but he doesn't have the kind of erudite background of so many of the people with whom he's traveling. And so I think the turn to Kafka, and of course he ends up caring deeply about people like Klima and others, and devotes an enormous amount of energy outside of his writing desk, which is highly unusual for him, to helping to support these writers. And then he starts essentially a private publishing house under the aegis of Penguin, publishing them and giving them voice. But the inclination, the initial motivation, I think is not, I wouldn't call it selfish, but it's defensive. And so I don't think that effort is I think that's what prompts that effort.
I know you have more questions. Yes.
Forcing me across back.
Sorry, get your workout in.
And I think it's only fair to say, as the biography of Philip, that if there are women in the audience who have questions, we encourage them to speak. Yes.
Sorry, I'm very male. I wanted to ask a question about the biographer's art, both in terms of your use of like source material. You know, you mentioned 29, I think, novels. Obviously, there's essays and all the other stuff, and then you did all these interviews. So if you could speak about that a little bit. And then also in terms of this sort of, very large, comprehensive biography that preceded yours and, has had kind of a controversial reception. I guess I was curious to know your own motivation in thinking about like the scale. It's a slimmer volume, maybe a brisker read. Did you have a certain motive as a biographer coming kind of after the bigger book?
I wanted to write a book that someone could hold, like a novel. I didn't want to write a doorstopper. And so I didn't adapt this to the series that I edit. I didn't make it more Jewish, for example, because it's under the rubric of Jewish lives. I would have written it the same for another publisher. And the process of writing is pretty arduous. While writing the book, I forgot to renew my California driver's license. I forgot to renew our health insurance. I forgot my oldest son's birthday. It's all encompassing, and I don't miss it at all, and I miss it profoundly. And so I had the sense that I wanted to write for both the uninitiated and the initiated, as I mentioned. I wanted to introduce readers who were either turned off by him in the wake of the Blake Bailey book, in the wake of the various cultural currents the last several years, to his voice. And I didn't want to lose them. And beyond that, it's very hard to describe the writing process. I paced myself so that I would read a great deal about some aspect of his work or one of his books, and then realize the time had come to write. And then I'd write. And I've in rereading sections of the book, I can't remember how they were produced, and you don't. And you're writing a book like this, and you have to finish it, and a writer's life is constantly engaged in a midway point between not producing too quickly and writer's block, and both are the enemy. And so that writer's block must be inconceivable, and writing it too quickly will destroy the book. And so beyond that, I'm not a writing teacher, and I don't know that I could actually do that in the way that some of you in the room do it. I can't describe the process, and I tried to learn as much as I could. I think it requires, writing a book like this demands enormous amount of memory, because you have to just remember what it is that 120, 125 people have said to you at various points. You want to identify certain characteristics that make sense, while at the same time allowing for equivocation. And you want to be able to bring the person to life while you recognize that there's always, the person is, the reason actually I chose this picture for the cover, he's sitting at his desk in Yaddo, and there's a glass separating the onlooker from Philip, because it seemed to me that was an appropriate representation of what biography is. You're not in the room. We're looking from outside, and you're looking at what the person is doing, but you're imagining what the person is doing because you can't see the page. And so it's an intimate process. It's a process that is all-encompassing, and I can't describe it.
Just to add one thing here, because
Does it make
Philip's...
sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. Philip's great sentences always came in the revision. He struggled with them. He would say he would spend 8 hours, 4 hours writing it one way, and then for another 4 hours writing it the other way. And for him, it was the process of revision. That's when he it was imperfect. He hated it. He struggled. It was disgusting. It went for a walk, went for a swim, went for this, went for that. Came back to it, kept pushing and pushing, pushing. And he knew when he took the glass and he went like this and the sound was pure. So for him, it was revision. I don't know. It's always like that for me, and very different. No.
So how would, if you were asked that question, well, how did you write your books? You wrote about 2 books about 2 profoundly difficult women.
You just push the sentences around and beat your head on the floor until a sentence will, in my experience, if you just sit there, your unconscious, what you know and you can't say, it will surprise you with what it was you wanted to say. That to me is something that happens, and I can't go to it. I can't go to that place. I have to wait patiently until the boulder moves aside.
I think what drew me in many ways to Philip and kept me going was the absolute preoccupation with writing as perfect sentences as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was sentences, clarity of thought that helped me, I suppose the word might be escape from the home I was raised in. And so it was the capacity, the relationship between sentences and clarity is something that's always been absolutely crucial to me, which is actually, there are many, 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 many reasons to hate the person who's now president. But I think what actually hits me the most, the hardest, is the destruction of language. And I'm not saying that that's the worst thing. It's not the worst thing that he does. But it's that actually I react most viscerally to. And it's the antonym, if you will, that kept me writing this book. And the desire to be as absolutely clear as possible about someone whose work I relished, and to try to describe it, I suppose, with clarity. And first drafts are wretched. You hate them. You just, it's like dirty, really dirty clothes. But you have to be able to sustain yourself and get beyond it. And then there's the 3rd and 4th and 5th and 7th. There is Judith alluded to this. There's something peculiar about, and I started thinking about this only when I passed the age of 70. There's something peculiar about devoting your life to writing. You're in a room. You have to be. You're worried. You're not only worried while you're writing. You're worried about getting enough sleep before. You're worried about getting enough exercise so that you could sleep into the following night. You're thinking about your text while you're at lunch with a loved one. You can't stand the fact that you're doing this, but you can't stop it. And And there is something peculiar about spending one's life 7 hours a day for years and years and years in a room producing words. And not permitting yourself to go outside. I mean, I remember Philip turning to me at one point, and he said, I live down the street from the most beautiful park in the world, and I can't allow myself to go there because of my work. And this was after he stopped writing. And so there is something peculiar, as Judith alluded to before, about the kind of people we both write about.
I wish we had more time. I'd love to keep talking. We don't, but Steve will be signing copies of the book, and I'd like to thank Shelby White for her incredible, as a biographer especially, her incredible generosity, and the Leon Levy Foundation for this, supporting this difficult, sort of impossible vocation, and of course Kai Bird and Tad Zukovsky.
And let's thank Judith, please.